Today we are reading the story of Farolitos for Abuelo. This story is by New Mexico author Rodolfo Anaya, and it's illustrated by Edward Gonzalez. This story is one of my favorites because growing up, I also was able to celebrate different traditions. I'm sure you have as well. It is so nice as the holidays are approaching for us to be able to reflect on what our families have done in the past, the new traditions that we are starting together, and to be able to reflect on special occasions, the times that we share and that we can celebrate. Let's begin. Farolitos for Abuelo. Luz awoke and looked out the window. Storm after storm had swept across the Sangre de Cristo mountains this winter, leaving the village of San Juan snuggled under a blanket of snow. Thin columns of smoke rose from the chimneys of the neighboring houses. Luz dressed, then hurried to put kindling in the kitchen stove. Soon a fire roared to life, and she put the coffee pot on. Her abuelo came in the back door with a load of firewood in his arms, which he dropped in the wood box. Buenos días, te dé Dios, mijita, he greeted Luz. Buenos días, abuelo, Luz said. She went to her grandfather and gave him a kiss on the cheek. Your coffee will be ready soon. Ay, gracias, the old man thanked her. Luz always made coffee for her abuelo in the morning. This was a special time of the day that they loved to share. By the time her parents got up, the kitchen was nice and cozy. You and your abuelo are a great team, Luz's father said as they ate breakfast. Luz smiled, and abuelo winked. That afternoon, when Luz returned from school, she sat by her abuelo, and he helped her with her homework. I'm ready for spring, Luz said as she put her books away. It's been a long, cold winter, abuelo agreed, but already the days are growing longer and warmer. Soon, the snow on the mountain peaks will melt and the river will rise. When the earth thaws, we can plant our garden. Every spring, Luz and her abuelo planted a garden of corn, chile, squash, and tomatoes. Luz's mother would cook the vegetables for their meals. And we can go fishing, Luz said. Yes, abuelo smiled. Luz loved to go fishing with her grandfather. Every spring, they were the first ones on the river. Just as abuelo foretold, the snow on the mountain soon began to melt, and the river began to rise. The grass grew green, and buds were ready to burst on the apple trees. On the first warm day, Luz found her abuelo digging for worms in the garden. Time to go fishing, he said. Yes, Luz shouted, and ran to pack a lunch. There were still spots of snow under the shade of the pine trees as they followed the path by the river up the mountain. They arrived at their favorite fishing spot and sat on the bank of the roaring river. In an hour, they had caught 3 large rainbow trout. I love spring, Luz said. Spring follows winter, abuelo said. Each season has a purpose. In winter, the earth is at rest. In spring, the earth comes alive. While they were eating their lunch, 4 boys from the village came running up the path. Hi, Luz, they called. Catch anything? Luz showed them the trout. Hey, let's fish, Carlos, one of the boys, called to his friends. Nah, let's play, Ernesto replied, pointing to a huge dead tree that lay across the river. He grabbed a stick and leaped on the tree. I dare you to cross, he said, taunting Carlos. Out of my way, Carlos shouted back. He too picked up a dry branch and started towards Ernesto. Standing on the log in the middle of the rushing water, they began a mock sword fight. The other boys cheered them on. Be careful, Abuelo shouted. But it was too late. Just as the old man spoke, Carlos slipped and plunged into the cold water. The swift current swept him away. "Help!" the boys called. "Carlos fell! Help!" Abuelo quickly ran along the bank of the river with Luz close behind him. When they came to a clearing, Abuelo jumped into the water and grabbed Carlos by the collar. Together they tumbled in the deep current until Abuelo grabbed some tree roots and pulled them out. "Go, get help," Abuelo gasped, and Luz turned and ran. She had never run so fast in her life. She raced to the village store where some of the villagers were gathered. They responded to her cries and followed her to the scene of the accident. The men covered Carlos and Abuelo with their jackets. Both had to be carried home. Carlos was safe, but by the time the men got Abuelo home, he was stiff with cold. Luz's mother put him to bed immediately and brought him hot tea to drink. That night, Abuelo had a high fever. By morning, he could barely breathe. The doctor came and gave him some medicine, but Abuelo didn't respond. The cold turned to pneumonia. "Abuelo is dying," Luz's father and mother explained. "No," Luz cried, "he can't die." She went to her abuelo's bedside and held his hand. "Don't die, Abuelo," she cried. "Mi hija," he said in a hoarse whisper. "Remember, there is a purpose to every season. In the spring, the trees bloom. In the winter, they go to sleep. Once I was young and strong as a tree. Now it is time for me to rest. Just remember, I will always be with you." Luz hugged him tight and told him she loved him. That night, Abuelo died. The neighbors came to say a rosary. They stayed all night with Luz's family and prayed for Abuelo. The women brought food for the mourners. They filled the kitchen table with pots of beans, pozole, roasts, red chile, and tortillas. The people remembered all the good things Luz's grandfather had done for the village. Luz sat by the coffin. She was very sad, but she thought about what her grandfather had told her. It was time for him to rest. The following day, they buried Abuelo in the Camposanto by the church. They buried him next to his wife, who had died many years before. The last few weeks of school were difficult for Luz. Although she kept busy helping her mother, the days seemed empty without Abuelo. That summer, Luz worked hard in her abuelo's garden. She pulled weeds, hoed around the tender plants, and watered them every day, just as her grandfather had taught her. In the fall, school started again. Luz gathered the vegetables, and when the frost came, the plants withered and died. December came, and everyone in the village prepared for Christmas. The boys went up the mountains to cut trees. The priest got the villagers together to present Los Pastores, the nativity play they performed every year. In Los Pastores, some of the villagers dressed as shepherds going to Bethlehem. On Christmas Eve, they walked down the village road on their way to church. They always stopped at Abuelo's house. Last Christmas, Luz and Abuelo had lit Farolitos for them. "I want to do something special for Abuelo," Luz told her parents the morning before Christmas. "What would you like to do?" her mother asked. I want to place farolitos around Abuelo's grave, Luz said. That's a wonderful idea, her father replied. Late in the afternoon, they put on their coats and jackets and went to the cemetery. They put farolitos around her grandparents' graves. Luz lit the candles. She prayed for her abuelo and thought of all the things that they had done together. It looks beautiful, a woman said. I have extra bags and candles, Luz said, and she helped the woman place farolitos around the tombstone of her husband. Luz's father went to the store for more bags and candles. Soon, everybody was making the simple lanterns to place around the grave sites. Across the cemetery, hundreds of farolitos glowed brightly in the cold dusk. Some of the villagers gathered to sing Christmas carols. A woman who lived near the church brought a huge pot of hot chocolate and bizcochitos to share. This is wonderful, Luz's mother said and hugged her daughter. Looks like you've started a new tradition, her father said. On Christmas Eve, I will light farolitos for Abuelo, and in the spring, I will plant his garden, Luz said to her parents. Just like he said, Abuelo will always be with me. Family comes in many shapes and sizes with many different family members. As you get together with your Sunset family, I hope that you will enjoy the start of Christmas traditions and enjoy some of the established Christmas traditions that you have. I understand you'll be making farolitos. I hope they come out wonderful. I hope that you'll be able to remember someone that is near and dear to your heart as you make your farolitos. Have a happy holiday season.